Hello, and welcome to the Books Uncovered podcast, a podcast brought to you by Fulcrum Publishing, where we explore the world of books and the people that make up the publishing and the book industry. I am Sam Shinta, publisher of Fulcrum Publishing, and today I'm joined for the first time by Allison Auck, Fulcrum's senior editor. Hi, Allison. How are you today?
Hi. I'm good, Sam. How are you doing?
I am great. I am so excited. We've done, I think, 15 or so of these podcasts. And it's just so wonderful to have you now joining us for the first time. How are you feeling about this?
Oh, I'm feeling really excited. I think we have a terrific guest, and I think that this will be a great conversation. I'm really looking forward to it.
Excellent. Well, how are things back in Colorado?
Things have been wonderfully springy.
Oh, that's great.
Yes, we have had some 80-degree days here, and it's been just absolutely lovely. And tomorrow, I think the high is supposed to be something like 45. So,
yep, Colorado. That sounds familiar.
Colorado weather, yeah. But really enjoying. Wish I could get out and enjoy it a little bit more, but I think the weekend will be nice. But yeah, things are great. We're really moving into spring. The flowers are blooming. The buds are on the lilac bushes, which I just noticed this morning. So I got really excited about that.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, here in Western Wisconsin, it's our second 80-degree day in mid-April, which is just bizarre.
Yeah.
And of course, all the neighbors were out, maintaining their yard equipment yesterday and making lots of noise. So it's going,
lots of noise.
Yes, so it's too soon for summer. So luckily, it's going to be back into the 50s and 60s next week.
Yeah.
We will get spring this year, which is wonderful.
Yes.
Well, as you mentioned, we have a terrific guest today. This is really, really exciting. Helen Betya Rubinstein's essays and fiction have appeared in Gulf Coast, the Kenyon Review, the Paris Review Daily, Literary Hub, and Jewish Currents, where she is a contributing writer. Her book, Feels Like Trouble, Transgressive Takes on Teaching, Writing, and Publishing, will be published by the University of New Orleans Press. Helen teaches at the New School and has an active practice as a writing coach. Welcome, Helen. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you so very much for joining us. We're really excited to have you. How are things in New York right now? Is it springtime in New York?
They have skipped from spring to summer as of yesterday.
Oh my
Hopefully
gosh.
we'll get to go back to spring. But yeah, it's like very hot, making me want to install the air conditioner all of a sudden.
Yeah.
It's like 85 degrees right now. So I'm actually
Oh my
sweating.
gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
I was talking with Kelly, our producer, the other day. She's out here in Wisconsin with me, and she said I was doing everything I could to resist the air conditioning this early.
Yeah. It's inappropriate.
Well, we're so excited to have you to talk today about craft and editing and coaching and writing and publishing. I think what really caught our eye initially was this wonderfully provocative essay that you did on Literary Hub, Against Copy Editing. Is it time to abolish the other Department of Corrections? Lovely title, by the way.
Yeah.
What inspired you to write this essay? Obviously, you were at a big New York publisher and we're reflecting on that time, but what inspired you to do this?
That's actually a question I don't have a great answer to. I think the idea for the essay came about as part of my proposal for the book that you mentioned, Feels Like Trouble, which I had decided to organize around a series of little against rants against conventions of teaching, writing, and publishing, and then to follow with a series of proposals or solutions or alternatives. And Against Copy Editing seemed like the natural place to start, in part because it's the beginning of my journey through publishing and writing and teaching. And because it's such a foundational way that kind of the broader public thinks about writing, like through this lens of grammar and correctness and punctuation, because that's where I think the majority of us begin with writing in elementary schools. It's like learning rules. And I definitely couldn't have written the piece like immediately after I stopped working as a copy editor, which was in 2010. I think it's my experience working as a teacher for 15 years and my experience as a writer being copy edited in different contexts that led me to write the essay the way that I did.
What kind of experiences have you had with people copy editing your writing? How has that been for you?
I mean, I've had a range of experiences. And, I can say, I think that the editors and publications with the least experience tend to copy edit the most heavy-handedly.
Sure.
And often that's a mark of their own insecurity. Sometimes, either insecurity about the way things are written or about their power in the relationship. Of course, I've also had wonderful copy editing experiences. But I think, I'm trying to think. I mean, a large part of my attitude about it comes out of being an MFA program. So I have two MFA degrees, one in fiction and one in nonfiction.
Okay.
And in both contexts, I think there was an emphasis on, the big picture rather than the sentence level, which is an emphasis that I've more recently begun to question. But for a long time, including when I was, really trying to turn against copy editing, I just was like, this is such a waste of time. And in a lot of MFA school conversations, I often felt like the sentence level stuff that we would talk about was just a difference in ear, like the way that one person likes this perfume smell, this person likes that perfume smell. And like, it's, like we're different people, we have different bodies, we have different life experiences. And often the sentence level stuff would seem to come down to that, where I'm just kind of like, okay, like you hear it better this way, I hear it better that way. I feel like it's either a waste of our effort to be in dialogue about this, or it's actually a dialogue about something else.
Do you feel like you had copy editors who were, or when you talked about it, you could talk about copy editors who were sort of in service of your own voice, who wanted to understand what it was you were trying to communicate and sort of took that as their lead rather than them imposing upon you their expectations? Did you ever feel like you had that kind of experience with anybody where you were partners and somebody wasn't necessarily too heavy-handed, and if you had something that you were really intent on keeping in your work, that they would listen to you, basically.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about that, a couple of examples come to mind. One is like publishing something with a very small literary magazine that got back to me maybe with like 4 edits. So I think those are lovely edits, but it's not the kind of experience. I mean, I did think they were lovely edits, but it's not the kind of experience where I'm like, oh my God, thank you. I'm just like, wow, that person just like zoomed in on things that I actually feel like, carry the vision of the work. And then I've had great edits where people rearrange things on a much more substantive scale.
Sure.
And then of course, I've also had people just catch errors, which of course I appreciate, like things that, my eye didn't catch.
Right.
But I think in part because I have an experience as a copy editor and because for whatever reason, and I actually think this is largely a question of like visual aptitude, whether people notice punctuation and things like that. I don't think it has as much to do with language as we think it does. So for whatever reason, like I'm pretty good at catching my own errors. And so I haven't had the experience where I'm just like, oh my God, thank you. You've saved me.
Right.
I've had that experience about substantive things in an essay, but not really about the line level. The line level stuff to me mostly feels gratuitous.
Okay. Well, that's
Yeah.
fair. Yeah, it's really good to hear. I like to hear different perspectives. I do different kinds of editing myself. And so I do copy editing, but I try to just, I think that really my main goal is preserving the author's voice.
Yeah. How do you try to do that?
Well, I mean, it depends on the person. It depends on their use of language. It depends on where they're coming from. It depends on a lot of things. I mean, I try to understand. I mean, obviously, I don't have a close personal relationship with the authors, but I try to establish a relationship with them and then understand what it is they're trying to communicate. And, if they have a particular voice, say somebody is an Indigenous person, right? I'm not going to superimpose a whole lot of stuff on top of that. I want to hear what the author is saying. I want to hear, and and while there are some constraints on me. I mean, I do have to do my job, but that's really my guiding light. I want to keep the author's voice alive. And if that means, breaking rules, if you will, or not applying rules, then that's fine. And I've been doing this long enough that I know the rules, and there are a lot that, are dispensable. So I try to work in tandem with authors. And I listen to them, and when they say, I don't agree with you, or how about this instead, or I don't want to change somebody's meaning. I don't want to, on the more substantive level, it's a little bit different. But on the sort of the line level, I still feel like there are ways that we can work together to make something, that's just make the book what it needs to be. Yeah.
Yeah. I think part of my resistance to it is I sense that not all authors know they have the right to say, I actually disagree with that change. And of course, it's often the authors with the least experience or the authors who grew up with the least social power, who feel the least entitled to say, please don't change that language. And even people with a lot of social advantage still know that no editor wants to be pushed back against infinitely. And editors have power over writers because writers want to be read. So that's a power dynamic with a limit to how much the writer gets to exert themselves.
Well, I mean, something that I always do in my communications with authors is I tell them immediately to please disagree. Anything that doesn't feel right. And there are plenty of ways to do that, but it's super easy to do if we're working in Word, say. There are plenty of ways to just add comments and say, I disagree, or this doesn't feel right, or you changed my meaning. I mean, I'm always really clear and upfront about, make sure I didn't change your meaning. Make sure, I don't want to squelch your voice. So, so those kinds of things are really important to me as an editor, and no matter what kind of editing I'm doing. But in copy editing, I know that people can be really, it's true, there is a power dynamic and people can be really intimidated by editors and copy editors.
Totally. Yeah.
I think I don't think that we're all, like that, for lack of a more articulate way to say it.
Uh-huh.
I
All
think
like
there are
what?
exceptions. Well, like who are really into, it's taking over the work, taking over.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally take your points, and I think you're right. And I see a lot of that, and I just try my best to make it clear that, again, that we're working together.
And one thing I'll say, I want to look up this person's name, but in the wake of that essay, in the wake of that publication, a few people contacted me. One was this super interesting woman, Sarah Baum, who runs a transcription company called Sharp Copy Transcription. And she was telling me how these questions of language come up in the act of transcription. And how, so for instance, when she's transcribing oral histories or transcribing court documents or ethnographic documents, how incredibly different it is, for instance, to put a white transcriptionist's transcription of someone speaking African American vernacular English next to a Black transcriber's transcription. And I think even the most well-meaning white person is not going to do as good of a job with that language. And yeah, I mean, I have several regrets about the version of that essay that I published. But one thing is that I didn't include enough about my own experiences being copy edited. And I also didn't include the conversations I had with writer friends, and especially writer friends of color, who include non-standard or non-conventional Englishes in their work, about their experiences being copy edited. During which I heard again and again that copy editors of color tended to be the best copy editors for writers of color. And, obviously that's not a universal statement. But yeah, that people hadn't experienced that many copy editors who really did want to honor their authentic voice, as opposed to just thinking they were honoring their authentic voice.
Sure. And I think, those of us who are white and have a certain amount of bias and privilege, I think no matter what our intentions are, I think you're right. I think it's impossible to do as good a job as somebody who's, and that's, that's a really valid point. But yeah, it would have been really interesting to include that in your piece for sure. So it's neat to talk about it.
Yeah. And another thing I didn't include, a lot of my attitude towards this, I think, comes out of being the daughter of someone who's an immigrant and speaks English in a way that a lot of people would describe as broken or bad or, imperfect English. And so I've certainly seen my dad be discriminated against because of how he speaks English and because of how he writes English, including within our own extended family, including by close friends of mine who I would think would be able to see through that, but somehow are so affected by his accent that they can't even really treat him as a real person.
Wow.
And so I think that experience gives me a complicated relationship to this, because I know that you get more respect from dominant culture when you write or speak in the dominant culture's language. But also, I love how my dad speaks. I love the idiosyncrasies of how he writes. And to me, it would be a tremendous loss to just erase those.
Yeah. No, I definitely hear that. That's, and that's really good as an editor myself. That's really great to hear. It's really important for me to take those kinds of things into consideration. And yeah. Where is your dad from?
He's from the former Soviet Union.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. And has he been here for a while, or is he?
Since 77. So
Okay.
yes, a while.
Okay. Yeah, that's a while.
Yeah. He's not really a languages person. So I think,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, neat. All right.
yeah.
Yeah, it's I love listening to this conversation because I think you're hitting on something so essential here. And we've been at Fulcrum, we've been publishing Indigenous materials for going on 4 decades. We're one of the leading publishers in the country on this area, and finding that appropriate balance and really honoring those voices is so important. And trying to find the balance of not being heavy-handed and letting people say what they want, how they want to say it, not just structurally, but also in terms of the content, the substantive matter. One of my proudest moments as publisher, this happened several years ago, but Wilma Mankiller, the former principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, feminist icon, approached us with a book proposal. She had done her autobiography with a large New York publisher, but had a new book that was essentially a convening of Indigenous women across the nation, where they were talking about what it was like to be an Indigenous woman in the present century, and what the struggles were, what the challenges were. But in her letter, which I just found for the first time in a long time the other day, she noted, and she underscored this when I spoke with her. She said, I brought this to you all because I know you will let me say what I want to say, that we had developed that reputation, and she had some concerns that other publishers wouldn't necessarily allow her to perhaps offend some people with the things that she needed to say, and to be honest about these things. And so building that reputation obviously takes a long time too. And I think, as Allison can attest, it's a constant struggle or constant piece of work to keep re-earning that trust and reestablishing that trust and faith that people have in you, so that you can continue with that. I agree with you that both at a structural level and the substantive level, the idiosyncratic nature of language and the beautiful ideas that stem from allowing those voices that haven't had the ability to share those voices in the past are so essential. So
what's the history of Fulcrum's involvement with Indigenous writers, can I ask?
Sure. We were approached in the late 80s by an Abenaki storyteller by the name of Joe Bruchac. He had a co-author, and they wanted to pull together some materials aimed at teachers that would share storytelling and environmental themes. We started as a nature publisher, as a stewardship and wilderness publisher. And so this fit in naturally with what we were doing, and wanted to do these materials that would then allow for teachers to access stuff in a more authentic way, because at the time there just wasn't anything out there. And they saw the environmental hook as a way to come at this. And so for us, right from the get-go, we made a decision by our founding publisher that we would do Indigenous materials, but only with Indigenous authors. And so that was really key for us, that unlike a lot of, say, university presses that are writing about Indigenous issues or have historically written about Indigenous issues by outsiders, we always wanted insiders. We always wanted people who were grounded in the culture, who had understood this from the inside out, and again, who might say things that weren't in the mainstream, at least in terms of what people's understanding was. And from there, it just grew. We were then fortunate enough to reissue Vine Deloria's God is Red. Vine was perhaps the greatest Native American intellectual of the last, say, 50, 60 years. And I served as his editor through many books and got to know him very, very well as a great friend. So we did several books with him, which of course then also enlarged our footprint in that area, because then people saw, well, if you're publishing Vine, who could be very provocative, you will allow for this sort of content. I remember Vine saying to me one time at a book signing, he said, you know how I know my book is going to be successful is when I start getting attacked by the mainstream press. because he said that means all the folks that really understand what I'm writing about will go out and get the books, because they will see that, oh yeah, he's speaking some essential truth. And so, yeah, we've really put a lot of stock in trade in that as we continue to work in that area. But it's like so much you're talking about, it's about building those relationships, right? It's about understanding the natural power dynamic that can take place, but then honoring those relationships in a way where you're trying to put everybody more into a team-centric position as opposed to a hierarchical sort of setting.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So your book contains the word transgressive,
Yeah.
and your essay contains this whole idea of this idea of more transgressive editing. What other things do we need to perhaps be more transgressive about in publishing, in book publishing?
Thank you for asking that question. It's a really good question. I should think more about that. I think the book is founded on something I write about in a different Literary Hub essay that was published quite a while ago, maybe in 2018 or 19, called Toward Changing the Language of Creative Writing Classrooms. And that essay, which is no longer totally up to date, but it's essentially about my attempts to remove value language from the class. So no saying good, no bad, no well-written, no working. And that was a choice I made, I think in 2017. I was like, you know what, I'm not gonna, actually it was earlier than that, 2016. I decided to stop believing in this construct of good writing. And I have found it incredibly fruitful to not approach writing in that way, and mine or anyone else's. And so a lot of what I do when I teach is trying to get students to think more deeply about what I've been calling their literary, aesthetic, and scholarly values as they approach their writing. I do the same thing with the writers I work with as a coach. I find that for a writer, defining their values early in the coaching process and using them as a foundation to evaluate their own work can be so regrounding when our sense of value gets totally dislocated by both teachers coming in and grading or assessing our work, and publishers coming in and saying, like, this is worth publishing, this is not worth publishing. And so anyway, that's a long and roundabout way of saying that I think, you know, the biggest take in my book project is a kind of anti-hierarchical, you could call it, anti-supremacist, or maybe anti-oppressive approach to thinking about writing and publishing that considers what it might be like to not value some work over other work, at least not in a collective or not in a universal way. I think that, you know, as individuals, we absolutely can value some work over others. But I get wary when it's institutionalized, when that kind of value system is institutionalized by businesses in a way that isn't about ethics, but about sales.
I absolutely love this message. So my publishing career has actually been broken up by a nonprofit work. I started a nonprofit a few years back. Kelly was actually working with me in that endeavor as well. And we did a writing coach program for high school students out here in Western Wisconsin. With the underlying approach was critical thinking. So we wanted to work with teachers to supplement with critical thinking approaches to communication, writing and oral, but mostly focusing on writing. But the idea was that, you know, valuing everybody's ability to be a contributing writer, and not this whole idea that, well, you've got these great AP kids and then everybody else. Because as you note, so much of this stuff could be circumstantial, that we saw kids that for whatever reason were thrown off the English bus at some point because some teacher just said, oh, well, you're not good enough, or you're not trying hard enough, or whatever it might be, or didn't really appreciate their aesthetic or their fundamentals.
Totally.
And the apex of this led to the creation of an 11th grade special classroom, where basically we took kids who we understood, we kind of worked with the principal and the English teachers to understand that there were these kids that had fallen off that English bus because some teacher at some point said, you're bad, or your writing is bad. And we wanted to experiment, and we ended up doing this for 2 years. We got grant funding to do this, to say, could we re-engage them with English and writing by approaching it in a more authentic way, by meeting them more at their level, by throwing, sticking with the general curriculum, but throwing all of the micro pieces of the curriculum out and rebuilding. And the results were phenomenal. I mean, you had kids who loved reading and writing again, because again, it was just this reinvestigation of saying it wasn't about good writing. It was about what you felt in terms of the quality. And then we could then steer that to these outcomes that were appropriate as necessary. But yeah, it was just what you're talking about. It just resonates really, really well.
I'm so glad.
How would we sort of incorporate this into the world of publishing? How do you envision that? I'm really curious.
I mean, I think that's such a good question, and I've been thinking about it a lot. I don't have an answer. I think the closest answer I have is, a vision of writer-owned publishers that are more like cooperatives, where writers are investing in publishing their work, maybe working together to achieve the values and goals they're going for in their work, and then are themselves, both putting in the resources and receiving the resources from the publication.
That's lovely.
Because, I think, I am very interested in thinking about this more. But one of the problems with publishers is they, no matter how good, as in like ethically good, publishers try to be, they evolved out of this like very deep history of certain people having resources to publish certain stories about certain people's lives. And of course, like, I mean, I guess it's just very clear that we're still stuck in this system. So even when mainstream publishers want to publish marginalized voices, it's most of the time, if not always, still money that comes out of a deep history of white supremacy that is being, redirected in this way. But it's not people owning their own stories, because the resources are still in the hands of the people with the resources,
right?
Who historically have held the power. And that to me is like, it's such a big deal, because it means that even the marginalized voices that we hear will be telling the stories that people with power accept.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a very deep problem. Yeah.
Yes, it has deep roots for sure. You're right. No, this is really interesting. Thank you. That's a great response. I really, it gives me a lot to think about as somebody in the publishing industry. And how I participate in that. So.
I mean, I can say, like, I have another book I've been working on for a very long time that's being shopped around to major publishers right now. And it tries to tell the story of a Jewish history that is less often told. It's less often told because it draws on a few different Jewish cultural experiences. It's not about a Jewish cultural experience that we have seen a lot of in the media. Like, it's not Woody Allen, it's not Philip Roth, it's not Schindler's List, it's not Fiddler on the Roof. And a lot of the responses I've gotten have been so transparently about people who, or from people who cannot accept a different kind of Jewish story from these stories. And, you know, in particular, I got a response from one person that was like, I was so excited to read this because my parents or my grandparents immigrated at the turn of the century from Odessa after pogroms. So I knew I would relate to it. And but I didn't find the story I wanted to hear. And I was like, well, that's because I'm not telling that story. Like, I'm not writing Fiddler on the Roof. We know the story of Jews coming to the US at the turn of the century. And it's so frustrating and yet such a reflection of history that that's the person who has the power right now to determine which kinds of stories are being told. And, you know, that my example is such a small, minor example in the scheme of the kinds of stories that are being told that don't reflect our dominant narratives.
Yeah. Well, I'm really interested in this book.
Thanks.
I really want to know what the stories are. But yeah. That's a great example right there.
Yeah, it's a good example. And yeah, like I said, I'm sure there are much more, you know, lesser known, more important stories that are also trying to be told.
Yes, there are. Yes, many.
Yeah, what you're describing, I think there are publishers that are trying this, but of course, the way the publishing model works generally also seems to push against this. And it's such a resource intensive business. I was just talking about this with an independent bookseller yesterday, who's fairly new to the industry, and explaining that, you know, for the average publisher, we're paying so much up front for the hope of return months and many months down the line. And so part of what you're talking about is going to have to not only entail a new way of thinking about publishing, but it's stem to stern. It is everything about the industry has to be rediscovered. And implications for everything from returns policies to payment terms to who is selling and how they're selling books and discounts and all these pieces. It's such a comprehensive set of changes. But, you know, perhaps we are moving to a place in the culture where people are creating space for that, or I know there are some publishers that are certainly experimenting with different models to try and figure that out. So the hope is maybe if some of this starts getting more successful, and of course the stranglehold of the largest publishers can somehow also be broken. And I think it was the author Charles Johnson, who was a National Book Award finalist, had this great essay where he was talking about publishing. And in that, he noted the fact that, you know, small publishers are the crucible of this industry. We are the ones who ultimately are making everything happen because we're the ones who take the chances and break the paradigms. So the hope is that maybe there are enough of these that happen that your vision can start to come to life, because I think the culture is richer for that if that happens.
Yeah.
Both book culture and American culture, right?
Totally. And a big part of it is the lack of resources that we get from the government as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, this has just been wonderful. So when does your book come out from University of New Orleans?
It does not have a publication date yet.
Okay.
We're trying to coordinate it with this other as yet unsold book of mine. So
okay. Very smart. Excellent.
I don't know if it's smart or not, but that's the situation.
Well, I think both Allison and I are looking very forward to reading this when it comes out. So
Absolutely.
Thank
please keep us
you.
Yes.
apprised.
I will.
But now comes, well, we can actually talk about some books. So
Yeah.
the hey, what you reading part here. We're obviously talking about book craft here today. So Helen, what books are you recommending here on your shelf?
I mean, in terms of craft, I will heartily recommend one book, which is Felicia Rose Chavez's book, The Anti-Racist Writing Workshop. It's really a guide for teachers, but I think any writer has a lot to take away from it. And it's very much in line with my values as a person who encourages writers to write out of their values. It's a multidisciplinary look at the creative process as it can be nurtured in community. And just talks, it's also an autobiographical account of Felicia's experiences moving through writing communities, many of which were harmful, some of which were wonderfully fruitful. So it's kind of a blend of practice and theory and memoir. So I super duper recommend that book. I think it's published by Haymarket. I'm looking over to my bookshelf right now, but it's on a different bookshelf in the other room. And then the other book that I was thinking of mentioning as a craft guide is John Gardner's The Art of Fiction, as a kind of classic. And I recommend that hesitantly, and I call it a classic with all of the loaded and problems that term might suggest. I think it has some very useful things in it, including one page about psychic distance that I refer to all the time in my work with coaching, in my coaching work, and just in my thinking about perspective as a tool for writers, whether they're writing fiction or nonfiction or poetry. But one writer I work with is currently reading that book, which I haven't read from beginning to end in probably 15, if not 20 years. And he was like, wow, this is a very old school book. Apparently Gardner only uses he pronouns when referring to writers and uses he or she when referring to readers. So I think that's just one example of the way it might be a bit outdated. Yeah.
Excellent. Great recommendations. And did you have a third too? I thought you had shared a third with
Kelly. I think I mentioned two books that were tied for third.
Okay.
One was Milan Kundera's The Art of the Novel.
Oh, there you go. Sure.
I also haven't read in a long time, but remember really loving. And now I want to remember the other, Peter Elbow. I don't know if you all are familiar with him because he comes from kind of a different sphere. So in addition to a creative writing background, I also have studied composition, like in the sort of composition rhetoric field in universities, and also at the Bard Institute for Writing and Thinking. And Peter Elbow is sort of like a grandfather figure from that scene. And he writes a lot about the writing process, and has these kind of classic tools that he suggests writers use. So I think the book of his I recommended is Writing Without Teachers, which I believe has one of his most iconic essays in it, The Process of Writing Growing. And I think he has another essay called The Process of Writing Cooking. But he describes the writing process in ways that can be revelatory to people who haven't spent a lot of time in the writing world and to people who have spent a lot of time in the writing world. I wanted to bring in someone from a little bit outside of the creative writing disciplinary scene.
Excellent recommendations. Thank you for those. Allison, what about you?
Well, I had a hard time deciding, but and I have some that are not quite craft books, but I do have one book that I really enjoyed by Jane Allison, which is
Meander
called,
spiraled.
yes, and it's Meander Spiral Explode. And the neat thing about this book and what she does is she subverts the traditional narrative arc. And I don't know if she ever uses the word subvert in the book, but I like to think of it that way. And what she does is she introduces different ways of creating narrative based on patterns in nature. And so hence the title, Meander. Now I'm forgetting the order, Spiral, Meander, Explode, or Meander, Spiral, Explode. But she takes, and you know what, I wrote down the patterns because I knew I wasn't going to be able to remember them. I looked. She's got meanders like rivers. She's got spirals like, what does she use? The fiddlehead fern, I think, or a nautilus shell. Radials or explosions like the sun, flowers, cells like beehives, fractals. Also, she uses all these various patterns, and then she sort of explores different pieces of literature and how they reflect these patterns. But what she's trying to do is to say, how do we move through narrative? How can we move through in a way that's not a chronologically informed time? So how do we move? How do we relate to the stories based on patterns? What do patterns do? So what does a spiral story look like? What does a meander story look like? It's a story that's, somebody taking a walk and then full of, I think, what she calls digressive loops. So taking a walk and finding something over here and finding something over here. And it's just a way of looking differently at narrative. And I enjoyed it. And she had some interesting things to say about the traditional sort of masculine view of the narrative arc, the dramatic arc. So I would really recommend that book. It sort of opens doors to other possibilities. I don't know if you've read it, Helen.
I have. I was very frustrated by that book.
Were you?
I think it's a wonderful premise to consider, first of all, the heteromasculinity of our traditional narrative arc or dramatic arc. And then I found the rest of the book beyond the introduction to be quite disappointing, I think, because it describes a lot of patterns, but it didn't have the rigor in connecting them to the source texts. I was frustrated by the choice of the source text, which seemed to come from a really narrow canon. And most of all, I felt like description is less interesting and less important than a conversation about what structure actually does and the function that it serves. So we can describe structure till the cows come home. And when I teach workshops on structure, I often start with a bunch of pictures, including from Jane Allison's book and from John McPhee's work on structure. But I think it's more important to think about why we structure things in different ways. And I felt like that book didn't really get into that. So I actually wrote something which isn't framed as a response to that book, but which was a response to that book, which is also in Literary Hub. It's called The Best Sex I Ever Had Was Also a Narrative Structure.
Okay.
And I used Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are, as a way of thinking about what structure actually does for a reader. So to use Nagoski's term, it facilitates expectation, enjoyment, and eagerness. And so I was interested in thinking about those functions of structure in the wake of reading Allison's book.
No, that's really interesting because I don't have your background. I don't have my education is very different. And so for me, it was really eye-opening, but I think you have a much deeper understanding
Mm.
of these kinds of things than I do. And for me, it was a really neat way to open the conversation. Um,
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
yeah, but I love hearing your response, and thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, the other book, or another book I had, was not really a craft book, but I had to bring poetry into it because I
Mm.
love poetry. And I just wanted to mention Joy Harjo's Catching the Light.
Mm.
Don't know if anyone's familiar with that book, but it's a very short book of very short vignettes written by Harjo about her life as a writer and what informs her writing, cultural issues, the native issues that come into play, which of course, if you've read her poetry, you know, that's a huge part of what she does. And I wanted to read, she's got some gems in there about writing that I felt like were
Mm.
really inspirational and really, I don't know, just really, yeah, really inspirational for writers and anybody who's interested in writing poetry or anything. And if I can read a quote, I know we're probably running short on time, so I will just read one quote instead of two. But she says, I do not know when the first poem was, where it came from, or exactly how. I just know how much I needed it. The scrawl, the questioning, the words lining up in musical sense to make something from the everything of nothing. I was in the dark and decided to investigate the dark to find the light. And I just thought that was a really beautiful way of talking about what inspires her to write and what can be inspiring for others to write. She ends the book with a really great quote too, but I'll stop there because I want to hear what San's books are. I have two more, but I'll cut myself off.
Yeah, we could probably talk forever about books about
Yes,
books.
I have a whole
And
stack.
so this time it was actually a challenge because we actually did an earlier podcast on craft, and so I talked about a couple of books then, and so I decided I only had one to start with, which was a little mini collection I picked up in the UK. It's a collection of George Orwell's essays, Why I Write. And it just pulled four of his essays on writing, but it includes one of my all-time favorite essays, Politics in the English Language, which famously includes Orwell's 5 Rules for Writing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, which is just a terrific list. But I also teach political theory and government at the university. And so I really feel that Orwell and probably Hannah Arendt are our two best writers in terms of how language can be manipulated in political language, and how politicians or political leaders, influential folks can misuse language in order to try and corrupt to their ends effectively. But it's just a wonderful essay, but it's a 100-page collection of just 4 essays, which is terrific. And then this past weekend, I found myself in one of my favorite independent booksellers, Mystery to Me bookshop in Madison, Wisconsin. And lo and behold, they had 2 books in their new book thing on this writer's life idea. And both of them incredibly short, and both of them I just read this weekend and absolutely loved. The first is by Stephen March, who's a Canadian writer, but also does journalism here in the US. This is a book he wrote called On Writing and Failure. And it really talks about how writers have to embrace failure, because so much of what writers do is not going to succeed in terms of what the commercial understanding of successful writing is. And he uses examples throughout history of, famously Melville, but also people like James Baldwin and the like, just to point out, or Dostoevsky, Ovid being exiled, or Machiavelli being exiled, as writers who've had to struggle to see their craft, or sometimes time having to catch up with their craft. So it's a wonderful short book. I'm going to start giving it to every potential author just so that they always understand the context. And then this one, This is a new book by New Directions Press called The Illiterate by Agata Kristof, who is a Hungarian-born writer. And it's not just about writing, but there is a piece in there about the writing life. Kristof was born in Hungary prior to the Soviet Union taking over Hungary. And so she is a native Hungarian who learned Hungarian, who then had the Russian language imposed on her with the Soviet takeover. So all of a sudden has that dislocation of a new language. And then she escapes from Hungary in 1956 with the revolution, and escapes to Switzerland, and then has to learn French. And she writes this at halfway through the book. But above all, that day at the end of November 1956, I lost forever my sense of belonging to a people. This whole idea that my mother tongue had forever been lost to me, and she had to rediscover language in order to start her writing life. And she then becomes an author and playwright, very celebrated. But this whole idea of the immigrant and the story of someone who is displaced, who then has to then buy their wits and by their perseverance. I mean, she starts by working in a factory. She's not just coming out as a writer. It takes that time. And here she is in her third language, basically saying, okay, now I want to be a writer, but I have to relearn everything to be a writer in this new language that is now surrounding me. It's just a wonderful, beautiful little, it's only about 60 pages, and it is just a lovely piece.
What's the title again, Sam?
It's called The Illiterate.
The Illiterate, right.
By Agata, Agota Kristof, Kristof.
Okay.
But Helen, when you were talking about your father's journey, it very much reminded me of this book. I mean, it just was such a terrific book of how language and how these ideas can persevere even in the most extreme of circumstances.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was just a wonderful conversation, and you've given us lots to talk about and lots to think about. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing in nurturing new writers and being transgressive in terms of the publishing industry and actually forcing publishers to rethink how they're doing things.
Thank you for that. That's wonderful, and we are really looking forward to your book, Helen.
Thanks. And thank you so much for having me. It was lots of fun to talk with you both.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Take care.
Take care.